All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to part 11 of the Artificial Intelligence course. This is in Unit 3, and we're looking at Prompt Engineering Phase 2, the context phase of prompt engineering. Let's get started. So let's start with what is context in prompt engineering? So the basic question, context in prompt engineering is a scaffolding. You build around it to give a flavor or a soul to your prompt. So while the task tells the AI specifically what to do, the context tells the AI things like who is speaking, who is listening, what world the response lives in, how to think, how it should feel, and how it should behave. Without it, you're going to get a generic and robotic response from the machine. But with context, you get a more tailored output that fits your specific situation. An analogy a way you can think of context is stage directions in a play. The script, which is the task, it's important, but the lighting, the era, the actor's motivation, that's the context. It defines the performance. When people say add more context into a prompt or in prompt engineering, they don't just mean words. They mean giving AI a clearer frame of reality to operate inside. Define a lens through which to interpret that task. So context shapes how the AI thinks about the task before it even starts generating an answer. Without context, your AI defaults to that average mode, a neutral, encyclopedic, slightly formal register, that robotic sort of thing that's aimed at a general audience. Context will override that. Think of it this way. If we ask the same question, explain how a bill becomes a law, this could be answered very differently depending on whether the speaker is a grade 4 teacher or a constitutional law professor or a political satirist, someone doing some comedy. The underlying facts don't change. What changes is the context of the question itself. All right, so let's start with the first part of this. Context prompting with a speaker. So when I say speaker, I'm talking about the source. The speaker is the who. So when we're giving context to this, you're instructing the AI to respond as a specific type of person or in a specific voice. A defined source or a defined speaker that has a background or expertise and a certain personality. This is who is talking. That's what layer of context we're talking about. When you define that speaker, you're narrowing the AI's vast database to a specific subset of knowledge and a specific vocabulary. More than just a job title, it's the intellectual framework. For example, a veteran teacher speaks differently than a journalist, who speaks differently than a museum guide, even though the task might be the same. So you can give the speaker specific motivations, like a speaker trying to persuade writes very differently than one trying to inform, who also writes very differently than one trying to entertain. So you can tell the AI to even role play that role. For example, role play a teacher or a journalist or a scientist or a career advisor or even a fictional character. So let's see some examples of speaker framing, where we're framing the context of the speaker or the source. So we put into our prompt, you are a veteran high school science teacher, explaining this to your class for the first time. You are a skeptical journalist who's covered this industry for 20 years. You are an enthusiastic museum guide, making this topic exciting for your visitors. Speak as a friendly barista, explaining coffee to a curious customer. Take the voice of a historian, analyzing events with academic rigor. Experts versus peers, speaking as a senior quantum physicist, will yield complex terminology and assume knowledge. But if we compare that with a study buddy, that's going to result in analogies and conversational clarifications of what's going on. If we look at a historical or a fictional sort of speaker persona, speaking as a 1920s newspaper editor will have a lot of different idioms and have a very different worldview than as a Silicon Valley tech lead. And then we also have a vibe shift. So we could speak as a supportive life coach, which will prioritize encouragement and a soft landing, whereas a drill sergeant will prioritize efficiency and directness. Using context prompting and defining that speaker or that source changes the level of authority or the level or the complexity of the language involved. Even types of explanations and the types of examples will change when given a context. So this matters. This is the AI's knowledge selection, the vocabulary selection, the sentence structure, and the assumptions all shift based on the persona or the source of the context. So let's look at some key attributes to define. Knowledge level. Are we talking as a novice or as an expert or someone who's completely and willfully ignorant? Trustworthiness. Are we talking from the position of someone who's honest but limited, deliberately deceptive, or naive? The social role. Is that source a mentor or a critic or a devil's advocate or a confessor or a tour guide? Is the persona, the who is speaking? What stakes? What does this person want? Do they want to warn you? Do they want to sell to you? Do they want to console you? Do they want to impress you? We can even move to that next level of nuance in defining our speaker persona. We could, for example, give the speaker a flaw or a blind spot. Like, you are a brilliant surgeon who's terrible at small talk and secretly dismisses non-surgical treatments. All of that context will direct the AI to formulate your output response in different ways. Let's move to another area. Let's look at the audience or the target of our context. So now we're talking about the audience persona, the whom we're talking to. This dimension is the one that often people forget. So they may define the source, who is talking, but we also could define whom we're talking to. Who are we writing for? We're framing and providing dimensions to create specificity. This could include age and experience level. For example, we could assume the reader of our output is a grade 10 student with no prior knowledge of this topic, like a high school student. We could provide the emotional state, like this is for someone who's anxious about the topic and needs reassurance first. But we could be speaking as an industry professional. We could be talking about prior knowledge. We could assume the audience already understands basic market economics, which are experts in a niche field. We could define a relationship to the speaker or the source. We could write as if we're addressing a room of skeptics or beginners with no background. We could define the purpose of the reader. The reader is trying to make a decision, not just learn something.
Elliot Lord, to the front doors, please. Elliot Lord.
We could define the attitude towards the subject. For example, is it hostile? Is it enthusiastic? Is it bored? Is it anxious? I'm providing a number of different examples here. Cultural context. We could define the metaphors and the analogies that will land. For example, baseball lands for American audiences. Cricket lands better for a South Asian audience. So by defining that audience, the analogies that are built will define better for that audience. We could define the audience's power dynamic. Is the AI speaking to your boss? Is it speaking down to a subordinate? Is it speaking across to a peer? Let's take a look at one remarkable use case. Your audience is a jury that has already decided the defendant is guilty. You are the defense attorneys, and your closing argument is trying to plant reasonable doubt without directly attacking their intelligence. When you define both the speaker and the audience, the source and the target, you're creating something close to a real communication situation. It prevents mismatches, like giving a PhD level explanation to a 12-year-old child. This matters. AI will adjust things like the depth of that explanation, clarity, assumptions come out, the jargon level, the complexity of that vocabulary, the pacing, the types and varieties of analogies, even the emotional tone. It frames the context. All right, let's move to another area of context prompting, tone and style. So we have the who, we have the whom. Tone and style define the how. This is the emotional flavor of the response and answers the question, what feelings should this output response carry? Without specifying a tone, the AI is going to guess the tone, and it might guess wrong. It defaults to a neutral encyclopedic voice. For example, a warm but professional tone versus a blunt, no-nonsense tone will produce very different output responses, even when the task itself is identical. You can shape tone along a spectrum. We can have a formal tone that's professional and authoritative versus a very casual tone that's very calm and neutral and tentative. We can have an enthusiastic tone that's very high energy and inspirational versus a very neutral tone. We can have a critical tone versus a supportive or sincere tone. We can have a humorous or playful tone versus a serious tone. We can have an empathetic, a warm, encouraging tone versus a dry, direct, no nonsense, and clinical tone. We can have a skeptic versus a reassuring tone. Let's look at some examples of tone in context prompting. Explain this in a professional academic tone suitable for a research paper. Explain this in a relaxed conversational tone, like a YouTube educator. We can have a rich tone context. Explain climate change with a tone of urgent concern, but not alarmist panic, as if speaking to a community leader who is already sympathetic but needs concrete motivation to act. By setting tone, we're influencing word choice. We're influencing the level of energy in the writing, the emotional intensity. We're setting how the AI frames uncertainty or disagreement. Style is different from tone, because if tone is emotional, style is structural or mechanical. Style determines how the information is shaped, how it is delivered, and it's about the craft and the structure of the language itself. It's answering the question, how should the words be assembled together? So style in context prompting includes the writing style. So this is concise writing, or verbose, or poetic, or journalistic, or academic. Are we providing plain language, or are we providing technical jargon? The formatting style. Are we asking for bullet points, or a narrative, or a step-by-step guide? Or are we asking for it in the form of a story? Rhetorical style. Is it going to be persuasive versus explanatory? Is it going to be Socratic and questioning versus analytical? What about the complexity style? Is it simple? Is it technical? What about the length? What about the pacing? And pro tip, you can blend those styles. For example, a legal brief written in the style of a noir detective's internal monologue. So we've provided a few different styles mixing together there. Here are some more examples. Write in the style of a concise executive memo. Use storytelling with vivid sensory detail. Explain using analogies and metaphors. Use short paragraphs and clear headings. Explain using analogies related to sports. Write in a concise textbook style format. Respond in the style of a sports column with short, punchy sentences, nicknames for subjects, dramatic metaphors, and an exclamatory rhythm. Deeper style dimensions could also include just basic sentence structure, short versus long, diction, Anglo-Saxon short words versus more polysyllables, figurative language density, like the number, if any, of metaphors that you should use, punctuation, dashes for drama, semicolons for formality, fragments for urgency. The amount of tone and style you can put in there will really start to structure your output. A tip for tone, you can even specify a specific person's style, like write in the style of Ernest Hemingway, short punchy sentences, versus write in the style of a legal contract, which is obviously going to have much longer sentences. All right, so to wrap this up with context prompting, let's look at the last few things to consider. So in addition to the source, the target, the tone, and the style, other aspects of context prompting could include a number of things for a good context within your prompt, which obviously can also include perspective. Perspective gives your AI a lens or a viewpoint, and it focuses values, focuses biases, details, assumptions, priorities, and nuances. It's going to frame your truth of the response. Let's look at some examples. We can have first person perspective, the I perspective, versus second person perspective, the you perspective, even third person perspective, the they perspective. We can have insider perspective versus outsider, expert versus novice, supportive versus critical. You're probably seeing a lot of overlap in all these categories. But again, if you get the main point, we're setting a context. We can have a philosophical perspective. Analyze this business problem from a stoic perspective. Focus on what can be controlled. We can have a professional perspective. Review this proposal from the perspective of a risk compliance officer, which highlights dangers and red tape. We can look at it the perspective from knowledge boundaries. Respond if you've never heard of the internet, forcing the AI into a specific historical framework. We can have a spatial perspective. Like, for example, we could give the perspective of inside the cockpit of an airplane versus the air traffic controller tower. Both have a different spatial perspective. We can have a different temporal perspective from 10 minutes after a disaster versus 10 years later from a disaster. There are other potential context-based prompt engineering areas that could include things like scenario, the where when. Situational context provides the why behind the prompt, and it helps AI understand the stakes. We can have background information to world build in our context prompt. This is the setting part of the context. We can have a cognitive frame, how to think. Is it meta context, telling the AI what mental model to use? A good example, think like a systems thinker. Focus on interdependencies. Can we have medium and genre context, the where and in what form? For example, this response will be spoken aloud by a text-to-speech voice in the car's navigational system. We can even have relational context, the history between the speaker and the audience. For example, the user has asked you the same question 3 times before, and you've already answered correctly each time. Respond as a patient tutor who is beginning to suspect that the user isn't really reading your answers. So this now frames the context phase of effective prompt engineering. In phase 1 of this unit, we looked at the task. Now we've looked at the context. We've defined the source, the speaker, the who. We've defined the target, the audience, the whom. We've talked about tone and style and perspective. This is giving our prompt context. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I hope you found that useful, and I hope you have a great day.